You're listening to Romancing in Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Hello, and welcome to the Romancing in Paris podcast. I'm your host, Lily Heise. In this podcast, we'll be traveling around the city as I pick out my top romantic spots per arrondissement. You don't have to visit these places only as a couple. Exploring them can be the expression of your own love of Paris. Are you ready to get romancing in Paris? Hello, and welcome back to Romancing in Paris. In the past 2 episodes, we've journeyed along the river in the Parc Rive de Seine, and then we worked up an appetite visiting the historic Passage des Panoramas, which is filled with fascinating history as well as great restaurants. To change things up in today's episode, as we return to the 3rd arrondissement, we're going to stop in at one of the loveliest smaller museums in Paris, one which was founded by a couple. And I hope this means that it is also rooted in love. Grab your chérie. We're going to le Musée Cognacq-Jay. We visited some wonderful museums on the podcast, including the Jacquemart-André, the Maison Balzac, and the Musée Bourdelle. The museums explored in the show are usually on the small to medium size because I think that these offer a better ambiance for sharing a romantic moment. No crowds, small rooms, and an intimate feel. These lovely venues often have a charming garden, like the Musée Rodin or the Musée Delacroix. So, if you like this particular episode, I suggest you go back and listen to some of these others, if you missed them the first time around. Today's museum also exudes romance on these various levels. Situated in the very heart of the Marais, on the quieter Rue Elzévir, at number 8 and close to Rue des Francs-Bourgeois, the museum houses a collection of 18th century art and decorative objects, amassed by Théodore Ernest Cognacq and Marie-Louise Jay, the founders of the Saint-Maritain department store, which might ring a bell, as it was much talked about in the past few years as it reopened after extensive renovations, and, somewhat controversially, was converted into a luxury department store. Despite this, even if you don't go in to do some shopping, it's well worth popping in the building itself to have a look at its beautiful Art Nouveau decor. This museum, however, doesn't have much to do with that particular store, except that its owners had a great deal of success and used this to thrive on their passion for art. Within the collection, some artworks in themselves are romantic, and we'll be getting around to these in due course. However, the museum's setting, the beautiful Hôtel de Donan, one of the oldest of the Marais mansions, is also what makes it perfect for an ideal romantic outing. But before we visit the museum, let's start by learning a little bit more about this historic mansion. As we've discussed on previous episodes of the podcast, the Marais became the heart of aristocratic Paris from the mid-1500s to the early 1700s. This is when the various monastic communities of the area started selling off their land as of 1545. We'll talk a little bit more about the origins of this in the next episode of the podcast, so stay tuned for that one. In 1575, Médéric de Donan, an advisor to the king and the Controller General of Royal Buildings, became one of the earliest to buy up one of these recently available plots of land, upon which he would commission an elegant home for himself. The architect remains unknown today, although some think with his experience in architecture, Donnan himself might have even been its designer. One thing is certain, Donnan's easy life living in his chic home was disrupted in 1588 when he was thrown in the Bastille by members of the Catholic League during the troubles of the Wars of Religion. He was only released 5 years later, in 1593. However, poor Donnan didn't get a chance to enjoy his mansion for long because he passed away only a few months later. His son inherited the home, yet, as he was childless, he bequeathed it to his nephew, who in turn sold it to financier Jean-Louis Le Marais in 1640. The Marais family owned it into the Revolutionary years, after which it was owned by a few other well-to-do families until 1839, when it was adapted for industrial uses, like many of the other private mansions of the Marais, and thus it fell into a terrible state. That is, until the safeguarding of the Marais, which took place as of the 1960s, a time when national and municipal governments decided to save historic buildings from being destroyed, and often turned them into museums or libraries. The Hôtel Donnan was in such a dismal state when the city of Paris bought it in 1974. It took quite a lot of restoration, and it was chosen as the spot for a new home for the Cognacq-Jay collection. So, who were the Cognacq-Jays, and how did they manage to build such an impressive art collection? This part of our story begins in 1838 with the birth of Marie-Louise Jay in the hamlet of Villars in the French Alps, not so far from Geneva. Coming from a modest background, her father being a stonemason and her mother a farmer, she was one of 8 children. Marie-Louise had to go off and work at a young age. When she was 15, Marie-Louise, her aunt, and a cousin traveled to Paris in search of work. This was at the peak of the modernization of Paris under Baron Haussmann, and the city would have been abound with opportunities. Destiny would have it that Marie-Louise found a job as a sales clerk in La Nouvelle Eloise, a lingerie shop. Quite the romantic place to meet her future husband and fellow employee of the shop, Ernest Cognacq, in 1856. Ernest Cognacq himself was born in 1839, a year after Marie-Louise, and on the complete opposite side of the country, the Ile de Ré, located off the coast from La Rochelle, in the western Atlantic province of Charente-Maritime. Despite their geographic distance, the husband and wife had a rather similar path in life. The death of his father when he was only 12 meant that Ernest had to go off and get a job. He was hired as a shop assistant in a clothing boutique in La Rochelle, before going on to work in others in Rochefort and in Bordeaux. This was a gradual rise in each city's size, before taking on France's ultimate ville, Paris. Moving to the capital at age 15, Ernest worked for a few months at a shop called Au Louvre, then at Aux Quatre Filles d'Aumont. Maybe life in the big city didn't suit him after all, because Ernest moved back to his native Charente-Maritime for a few years, then returning back to Paris at age 18. This is when fate struck him, courtesy of his new job at La Nouvelle Heloise, where he would meet and fall in love with Marie-Louise. The two continued to build up their retail experience. Marie-Louise went on to work at the famed Le Bon Marché department store, and Ernest attempted his first shop, Au Petit Bénéfice, which was located, albeit briefly, on the Rue Turbigo. His own endeavor didn't work out so well, so he had to close it down and went on to sell fabric at a small stand at Pont-Neuf on its right bank size, near a former pump house on the river called La Samaritaine. Now, it's hard to imagine this today, but Le Pont-Neuf used to be quite a happening place. It was a meeting point for Parisians, and couples would often go strolling here, and thus do some shopping as well. Shortly before the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, Ernest opened a newsstand in the side building of a café along the quay. He decided to call this La Samaritaine. After the war, he rented it permanently and even was able to take on 2 staff members. Business was going well enough that he asked Marie-Louise to marry him the following year. She brought her experience from Le Bon Marché, as well as 20,000 francs she'd managed to save up. This allowed them to expand La Samaritaine. Timing was just right. The Belle Époque was kicking off, a time of great prosperity in France, and people were buying. In a matter of 15 years, sales at the shop went from 800,000 francs in 1876 to 50 million in 1898. Now, that does sound like a lot. However, don't forget these are anciennes francs, France's currency from before World War II. Still, that does sound like a lot of money. In 1905, they built the 4 large Art Nouveau-style buildings between the Seine and Rue de Rivoli. In 1900, they also built France's first amusement park, called Magic City. It was around the same time that the entrepreneurial couple began collecting art, taking a particular interest in art from the 18th century. They decided to first display their collection in the luxury section of their department store, a branch closer to the Opera on the Boulevard des Capucines. In 1928, they donated their collection to the city of Paris, and after their deaths, from 1929 to 1990, the collection was in an adjacent building to the shop there on the Boulevard des Capucines, until it was decided to be moved to the Hôtel Donon. In addition to collecting art, they also created a foundation which sponsored various facilities, including an orphanage, a retirement home, and a prize awarded to families with many children. Quite similar to the other art couple we've discussed on the podcast, the Jacquemart-Andrés, the Cognacq-Jays remained childless and dedicated themselves to their business and philanthropic activities. For their efforts, the couple were awarded various levels of the French Legion of Honor prize. They lived full lives of 87 and 88 years and lie in rest together in the Passy Cemetery. I think it's about time we pop by to visit the museum, don't you think?
If you're enjoying this episode of Romancing in Paris, you may also like to listen in to our sister podcast, Navigating the French, which explores the origins and cultural significance of a word in the French language. Romancing in Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Romancing in Paris.
The museum is free outside of when it has exhibits. Another good reason to go. But it's still worthwhile to go when there is an exhibit, especially if the theme is of interest to you. They're usually quite nice. Spread through 20 paneled rooms in the historic mansion, visiting the museum is like taking a tour of a historic home from the era. It features over 1,200 fine art and decorative art items, mainly dating from the 18th century. These vary from European and Chinese ceramics, jewelry, snuff boxes, furniture, and paintings by top artists of the time, including Boilly, Boucher, Fragonard, Watteau, Chardin, Canaletto, Houdin, and many, many more. There are a few works from other centuries which are of note, like Rembrandt, Corot, Cézanne, and Degas. I do have to say, the art themes of the 18th century were often romantic, and so, on your stroll through the museum, you might stop with your chérie to admire some frolicking lovers or mythological couples you spot here and there. I wonder if Marie-Louise and Ernest would ever take a break from their busy schedules to admire their own art collection together. Another reason I think the Cognacq-Jay is a great date spot is thanks to the museum's lovely garden. Found behind the mansion, as is the case with most of the mansions in the Marais, the garden is designed as a historic jardin à la française. You can admire its elegance while cuddling on one of its benches. In summer, there is also a café in the front courtyard of the museum. It's a lovely place for a break before or after your visit. If you're looking for something else to do in the area after you've finished your visit, you're a short walk from the Hôtel de Soubise, the subject of episode 3 of the podcast. You're also a short walk from Square Saint-Gilles Grand Veneur Pauline Rollin, which was also a subject of a different episode of the podcast. There are also plenty of other wonderful museums and sites in the Marais, a stone's throw away. Thank you for listening to this latest episode of Romancing in Paris. If you have a minute, please rate or review the podcast. It only takes a short moment and it's extremely helpful in attracting potential new listeners. You can find many more great ideas for romantic things to do in Paris and around the world on my website, jetammeneither.com. And there's plenty of other great listening material on the Paris Underground Radio website. Until next time, happy romancing in Paris.
This episode of Romancing in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.